was the last time you made something? Do you prefer to work alone or with others when working on a project? We're going to learn more about when God's people rebuilt the temple. But first, let's take a look at our big picture question. Can God be trusted? Yes, God cannot lie or ever be wrong, so we can trust whatever he has said. There is never a time when we cannot trust God. When God's people were rebuilding the temple and their enemies tried to stop the work, God's promises still came true. He led them to finish the project, and the people had a place they could worship God again. God always keeps his word. He promised to turn Abraham's family into a great nation. He promised to save his people from slavery in Egypt and bring them back to the promised land. He promised to send Israel into exile because of their sin. And he promised to send them back home again. God always keeps his promises. And today we will see that God finally allowed his people to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel and the high priest led a group of God's people back to Judah to rebuild the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. The priests rebuilt the altar. They gave burnt offerings to God and celebrated. They laid the foundation of the temple. The priests put on special clothes and the people praised God. But not everyone was happy. Some of the older people remembered the temple or what the temple had looked like before it had been destroyed. Other people interrupted the rebuilding of the temple by making the people of Judah discouraged or afraid. The building of the temple stopped for a while. God sent prophets to encourage the people. Darius, the king of Persia, ruled over the land of Judah. He put governors in charge of some of the land. A governor named Tattenai noticed what God's people were doing. And Tattenai asked, "Do you have permission to rebuild the temple?" The workers said, "We do." King Darius's officials searched the royal records for Cyrus's order, and they found it. It said, "Let God's temple be rebuilt. It will be a place to offer sacrifices. Let its foundation be rebuilt." King Cyrus had also ordered for the cost of the building of the temple to be paid for out of the royal treasury. So King Darius sent a letter back to Tattenai. He gave this order: "Stay away from the workers in Jerusalem. Give them whatever they need." Tattenai obeyed the king's order. The Jewish leaders finally finished the temple of God. The people celebrated and made offerings to God. They chose priests and assistants to serve in the temple, and then God's people celebrated the Passover. The temple of God was finally complete. It took many years for the people to rebuild the temple, and they were faced with constant troubles. Their enemies were interrupting the building of the temple. Tattenai caused problems as well. But through it all, God continued to encourage his people through the prophets. He promised that they would once again have the temple as a place to worship him, and God always keeps his promises. God's temple was a place for worship in the Old Testament, but today we are blessed with the ability to worship God anywhere. As Christians, God gives us his Spirit who lives inside of us, and through his Spirit, God is with us wherever we go. So wherever we are or whatever we are doing, we can choose to worship God every day. God's people rebuilt the temple so they would have a place to worship God. Years later, God sent his son, Jesus, to be with his people. Now, God does not dwell with his people through the temple. Instead, God dwells directly with his people through his Spirit. Jesus provided something better than the temple. He gives us himself. Now let's take a final look at our memory verse, Jeremiah 17:7. It says, "The person who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence indeed is the Lord, is blessed." When we place our trust in the Lord, we are blessed. God blesses us as we remember that he is with us. And because he is with us, we have no reason to worry or fear. Join us again next week as we begin to wrap up our study of the Old Testament.